You stand at the edge of Aksum in the northern highlands of Ethiopia, where the air tastes of dust and ancient incense. The year is 1965, and you've traveled thousands of miles to reach this place, driven by rumors of something impossible, that the most sought-after religious artifact in human history sits quietly in a small chapel, guarded by a single monk who will never leave, never speak of what he protects, and never allow another living soul to see it. The Ark of the Covenant. You've read about it in Scripture, seen it dramatized in paintings, heard it described in 1,000 sermons. The golden chest that held the Ten Commandments, the vessel that led the Israelites through the wilderness, the weapon that toppled the walls of Jericho, the throne of God's presence on earth. And according to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it's here. It's been here for nearly 3,000 years. But you won't see it. No one will. The Chapel of St. Mary of Zion stands before you, a modest structure by the standards of great cathedrals, yet it commands a reverence that makes your breath catch. Around it, the ruins of older churches crumble in the Ethiopian sun. Layers of history built upon history, each generation adding their stones to the story. Local priests move through the compound in white robes and turbans, their faces weathered by highland winds and long fasts. They nod to you politely, but when you ask about the ark, their expressions close like shutters. Only the guardian may approach it, one priest tells you in Gaz-accented English. He has been chosen. He will serve until death. You learn that somewhere inside that chapel, behind walls you'll never breach, lives a man whose name you'll never know. He was selected years ago, perhaps decades ago, from among the priests and monks of the Ethiopian Church. The selection process remains opaque. Some say it requires a vision. Others claim it follows bloodlines stretching back to Solomon's time. What you know for certain is this. Once chosen, the guardian enters the chapel's inner sanctuary and never leaves. Not for illness, not for family emergencies, not for war or famine or earthquake. He tends to the ark in solitude, performing rituals known only to him and to God, speaking to no one about what he sees or does in that sacred darkness. When he dies, his body is carried out. Another guardian is chosen. The cycle continues. You try to imagine it. The weight of such a calling, to be perhaps 30 years old or 40, and to know that you will never again walk freely in the world, that you will never again embrace your mother or father, never share a meal with friends, never feel rain on your face in the open air, that your entire existence will narrow to a single room, a single duty, a single object that you alone may witness. The loneliness of it staggers you. The devotion required seems beyond human capacity, yet it has continued, unbroken, for centuries. The Ethiopian Church's claim rests on a story found in the Kebra Nagast, The Glory of Kings, a 14th century text that weaves together history, legend, and theology into a national epic. According to this account, the ark's journey to Ethiopia began with a love affair. King Solomon, in all his wisdom and power, received a visit from the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopia as Makeda. She came seeking knowledge, drawn by reports of Solomon's legendary understanding. What she found was not just wisdom, but a connection that would alter the course of two nations. The Kebra Nagast tells you that Solomon desired Makeda, and she him. They shared a night together before she returned to her kingdom. From that union came a son, Menelik, who would grow to become the first emperor of Ethiopia. When Menelik reached adulthood, he traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. Solomon welcomed him, taught him, wanted him to stay and inherit the throne. But Menelik felt called to return to his mother's land. Here the story takes its controversial turn. The Kebra Nagast claims that Menelik, either with his father's blessing or through the boldness of his companions, took the Ark of the Covenant from the temple in Jerusalem and brought it to Ethiopia. The text suggests that God approved this transfer, that Israel had broken its covenant, and that Ethiopia would become the new chosen people, the new guardians of God's presence on earth. You know that scholars debate every aspect of this narrative. Some dismiss it as medieval propaganda designed to legitimize Ethiopian claims to a special relationship with God. Others find in it kernels of historical truth, noting that the Ethiopian Jewish community, the Beta Israel, maintained practices suggesting ancient connections to Temple Judaism. Still others point to the fact that the Ark disappeared from biblical and historical records after the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, creating a void that various traditions have tried to fill. What troubles you, standing here in the highland dust, is the utter seriousness with which the Ethiopian Church treats this claim. This is not folklore maintained casually at the margins of faith. This is the absolute center of Ethiopian Orthodox identity. Every Ethiopian church contains a tabot, a replica ark, which is considered so sacred that it can only be touched by priests and is paraded through the streets during major festivals with a reverence that approaches terror. The faithful prostrate themselves as the tabot passes, hidden under richly embroidered cloths, never to be glimpsed by ordinary eyes. If this is how they treat the copies, what must the original mean to them? You speak with scholars who have spent decades studying the Ethiopian claim. They tell you about the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion's history, how it was founded, according to tradition, in the 4th century CE when King Ezana converted to Christianity. They explain that Axum was once a great power, controlling trade routes between the Roman Empire and India, minting its own coins, building towering stone obelisks that still stand today, testament to engineering knowledge that rivals anything in the ancient world. But the Ark was already here by then, one Ethiopian historian tells you firmly. It came with Menelik, almost 1,000 years before Ezana. The church was built to honor it, to protect it. Everything else, the kingdom, the conversion to Christianity, the power and the glory, all of it flowed from the presence of the Ark. You note the reverence in his voice, the absolute conviction. This is not a man engaged in academic speculation. This is a man stating what he knows to be true. The question that keeps you awake at night in your small hotel room, listening to hyenas call in the hills beyond Aksum, is simple and impossible. What if they're right? What if behind those chapel walls, behind the guardian's endless vigil, sits the actual Ark of the Covenant? What if the greatest archaeological prize in history, the object that has launched 1,000 expeditions and inspired countless theories, has been sitting here all along, hidden in plain sight, protected by nothing more than faith and a single man's lonely dedication? The implications sprawl before you like a map of a country you've never visited. If the Ark is real, and in Ethiopia, then the Ethiopian Church's claims to ancient legitimacy would be validated. The history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam would need to be reconsidered. The relationship between Africa and the Abrahamic faiths would shift from peripheral to central. Ethiopia would not be a late convert to Christianity, but rather a keeper of its most sacred tradition, chosen by God himself to protect what Israel lost. But there's another question, quieter and more troubling. Why won't they show it? If the Ethiopian Church possesses the Ark, if they've guarded it successfully for 3 millennia, if it sits in that chapel right now, why maintain such absolute secrecy? Why not reveal it to the world, prove the skeptics wrong, establish Ethiopia's claim beyond doubt? Why condemn generation after generation of guardians to solitary confinement when a single photograph could change everything? The priests you speak with give answers that seem circular to your Western mind. It is too holy to be seen. God has not commanded us to reveal it. The time is not right. Faith does not require proof. One elderly monk puts it differently. He sits with you in the shade of an acacia tree, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes distant with thought. You ask why we guard it in secret, he says slowly, but consider what happened to every other holy thing that was revealed to the world. The temple in Jerusalem, destroyed twice. The true cross, broken into splinters and scattered. The Holy Sepulchre, fought over, bloodied, divided between competing churches. Everything that is shown becomes a prize to be claimed, a weapon to be wielded, a treasure to be stolen. He pauses, watching you absorb this. We do not hide the ark because we doubt it, he continues. We hide it because we know what it is. We know its power. And we know what humanity would do if they could possess it. The monk's words follow you as you wander through Aksum's archaeological sites. You see the massive stelae, some standing, some toppled by time and war. Their surfaces carved with false windows and doors meant to represent multi-story palaces. You visit the tomb of King Caleb and his son Gebri Meskel, descending into underground chambers where the air smells of stone and centuries. You examine ancient inscriptions in Ge'ez, Sabaean, and Greek, evidence of Aksum's cosmopolitan past. And everywhere, woven through every monument and every story, is the shadow of the Ark. The longer you stay in Aksum, the more you realize that the Ark's presence, or the belief in its presence, has shaped everything about this place. The layout of the churches, the organization of religious life, the very identity of the Ethiopian people has been molded around this secret. Whether the Ark is actually here becomes almost secondary to the fact that everyone believes it is here, has believed it for so long that belief and reality have merged into something unassailable. You try to imagine being the guardian in this moment in 1965, with the world changing rapidly beyond the chapel walls. Ethiopia itself is modernizing under Emperor Haile Selassie, who claims descent from Solomon and Sheba, who styles himself as the inheritor of 3,000 years of continuous monarchy. The Guardian would hear about these changes only dimly, if at all. His world has contracted to the dimensions of the inner sanctuary, to the daily rituals, to the object he serves. Does he ever doubt? Does he ever wonder if the sacrifice was worth it? Does he look at the Ark, if indeed he looks at it, if the rituals even permit direct viewing, and feel the weight of all those centuries of guardianship pressing down on him? Or has he transcended such questions? Has the isolation purified his faith to such a degree that doubt cannot enter? Is there a peace, perhaps, in having given everything to a single purpose? You realize you're romanticizing, projecting your own ideas about devotion and meaning onto a person you'll never meet. The Guardian is not a symbol or a story. He's a man with a man's needs and a man's struggles, living in conditions that would break most people. The fact that you can't know his name, can't know his thoughts, can't even confirm that he exists at this very moment, it frustrates you. It also, you must admit, adds to the power of the mystery. As your time in Axum draws to a close, you find yourself returning again and again to the chapel of St. Mary of Zion. You stand at the boundary that pilgrims and tourists alike cannot cross, as close as you're permitted to come. You study the chapel's exterior, noting its simplicity, its lack of ostentation. For the supposed dwelling place of the world's most important religious artifact, it's remarkably humble. Perhaps that's the point. You watch as priests come and go, never entering the inner sanctuary where the Guardian lives. Food is passed through a small opening, you're told. Waste is removed through another. The Guardian's physical needs are met with the bare minimum of contact with the outside world. Even the patriarch of the Ethiopian Church, the highest religious authority in the land, does not enter that space. The Guardian alone has that privilege and that burden. A young boy approaches you, perhaps 10 years old, selling postcards of Aksum's monuments. You buy a few, and he lingers, curious about the foreign visitor. You ask him in your broken Amharic if he's ever seen the Ark. He looks at you as if you've asked the most foolish question imaginable. "No one sees it," he says simply. "That's not how it works." "But do you believe it's there?" He considers this, his young face serious. "My father believes it. His father believed it. All the fathers before, back and back and back. Why would they all be wrong?" It's a child's logic, but it carries a weight that centuries of theological argument might envy. Why would they all be wrong? Why would generations upon generations maintain this vigil, sacrifice their guardians, build their entire religious identity around something that didn't exist? The easy answer is that humans are capable of believing anything, of maintaining traditions long after their original meanings have been forgotten. The harder answer is that sometimes traditions persist because they're true, because they're guarding something real, something that transcends the need for external verification. You buy the boy more postcards than you need and watch him run off through the compound, his white tunic bright in the afternoon sun. Around you, Aksum continues its daily rhythms. Merchants selling spices and coffee, tourists photographing obelisks, priests chanting in ancient languages. And somewhere in that modest chapel, invisible and unknowable, a guardian keeps his watch. You wonder if he knows that people like you stand outside, asking questions, seeking answers. You wonder if he cares. You wonder if in his isolation he has achieved something that the rest of humanity spends lifetimes pursuing: absolute certainty about his purpose, complete dedication to a calling that transcends the self. Or perhaps you're wrong about all of it. Perhaps the guardian struggles with doubt every day. Perhaps the sanctuary holds something far different from what tradition claims. Perhaps the entire edifice of belief is built on a foundation that would crumble if examined too closely. But they won't let you examine it. That's the genius of the arrangement, you realize. By making the Ark absolutely inaccessible, the Ethiopian Church has made it absolutely indestructible. No carbon dating can disprove it. No archaeological excavation can debunk it. No scholarly analysis can diminish it. The Ark exists in a space beyond evidence, protected by silence and faith, and the body of a man who will give his entire life to a secret he cannot share. As you prepare to leave Aksum, you're approached by another priest, older than the others you've spoken with, his face creased with lines that speak of long years of fasting and prayer. He's heard that you've been asking questions about the Ark, about the Guardian. You want to understand why we do this, he says. It's not a question. You nod. Come, he says, and leads you to a place where you can see the whole of the church compound spread below. The sun is setting, painting the ancient stones gold and red. For 3,000 years, our people have kept faith with this calling. Empires have risen and fallen. Religions have spread and faded. Wars have been fought, won, lost, forgotten. But this, he gestures toward the chapel, this has remained constant. The guardian has never failed. The Ark has never been taken. But how can you know, you ask? If no one can see it, if no one can verify it, how can you be certain it's still there? The old priest smiles, an expression of infinite patience with your Western need for proof. Every morning, he says, the guardian performs rituals that have been passed down since the time of Solomon. Every morning he tends to what is inside. If the Ark were gone, if the sanctuary were empty, do you think he could maintain the pretense? Do you think he could live year after year with such a lie in his heart? Do you think God would permit such a deception? Men have lied for less, you point out. Yes, the priest agrees, but not like this. Not in this way, not for this long. He's right, you realize. Whatever the truth of the Ark's existence, the truth of the guardian's devotion is undeniable. Real men have really lived out their lives in that sanctuary. Real sacrifices have been really made, whether they're guarding the Ark or guarding a tradition or guarding a collective dream. The cost has been paid in full, in human years and human loneliness and human faith that surpasses understanding. The priest leaves you there as darkness falls over Axum. You stand alone, watching lights begin to appear in windows across the ancient town, imagining one light in particular, one lamp burning in a sanctuary you'll never enter, illuminating an object you'll never see, tended by a man you'll never know. And in that moment, you understand that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, not because the truth is hidden, but because the mystery itself is the truth. The point, the message that echoes across millennia with a clarity that facts could never match. But still, you wonder. As you leave Axum the next morning, as the highlands fade behind you and you return to a world of television and telephones and rational explanations, you carry that wonder with you. What is in that sanctuary? What does the guardian see when he's alone with his charge? What would it be like to know absolutely that you're in the presence of something that once held the actual presence of God? These questions follow you home, follow you through years of study and research and conversation with others who've stood where you stood, asking what you asked. And you learn gradually that the questions themselves might be the Ark's final gift to the world. Not answers, not proof, not certainty, but an enduring reminder that some things matter too much to be reduced to evidence, that faith requires darkness as much as light, and that the greatest treasures are sometimes those we can only approach through imagination, reverence, and the endless patience of hope. What you don't know, standing at that boundary in 1965, is that the story of the Ark and its guardian is about to become even more complicated, that wars and revolutions will test the Ethiopian Church's ability to maintain its secret in ways that centuries of peace never did, that new guardians will be chosen under circumstances that will challenge everything the tradition has stood for, that questions of authenticity will give way to questions of survival, and that the next chapters of this ancient story will reveal whether faith alone can protect what time and belief have preserved. The guardian keeps his vigil. The Ark remains hidden. And the world continues to wonder, to seek, to stand at boundaries it cannot cross, asking questions that might never be answered. The year is 1974, and Axum is changing in ways that would have been unimaginable to you during your visit 9 years ago. Emperor Haile Selassie, who claimed direct descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, has been deposed by a military junta called the Derg. Ethiopia is sliding into revolution, and with it, every institution of the old order, including the church, finds itself under threat. You've returned to Ethiopia, drawn by reports that the new communist government is actively persecuting religious institutions. Churches are being closed, priests arrested, ancient traditions banned as superstitions that hold back progress. Your contacts in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church write to you in careful language, but their fear comes through clearly. They worry about the Ark. They worry about the guardian. Arriving in Aksum, you find a town under a new kind of tension. Soviet-style posters have appeared on walls, proclaiming the superiority of scientific socialism over religious mysticism. Young soldiers, barely out of their teens, patrol with rifles. The easy hospitality you remember from your previous visit has been replaced with watchfulness, with people measuring their words before speaking. The church compound of St. Mary of Zion remains, but its atmosphere has changed. Fewer priests are visible. Those who are move quickly, speaking in low voices. When you approach the familiar boundary near the chapel that houses the Ark, you notice something new. Soldiers standing. Guard not to protect the sanctuary, but to watch it, to ensure that nothing and no one enters or leaves without the new government's knowledge. You manage to arrange a meeting with one of the priests you knew before, but it takes days of careful negotiation. He finally agrees to see you in a private home, away from the church after dark. When he arrives, you barely recognize him. He's lost weight, and his eyes carry a wariness that wasn't there before. They want to know what's in the sanctuary, he tells you without preamble. The Derg officers. They've heard the stories about the Ark, about its golden construction. They think it's a treasure they can seize for the revolution. What have you told them? The truth, that only the guardian may enter, that our tradition is absolute on this point. But they don't accept such answers. They speak of progress, of ending primitive superstitions. They say that if there really is something sacred in the sanctuary, it should be displayed in a museum for the education of the people. If there's gold, it should be melted down for the benefit of the nation. You feel a chill despite the warm night. Can they force their way in? The priest is silent for a long moment. They have guns, he finally says. We have prayers. Which do you think will prevail? But something has prevented the confrontation, he tells you. The local commanders, many of them Orthodox Christians themselves, despite their Marxist education, have hesitated. There are stories, whispered stories, the kind that soldiers tell each other when officers aren't listening, about what happened to those who tried to violate the sanctuary in past centuries. Terrible stories, stories of men struck blind or mad or dead on the spot. Do you believe those stories, you ask? I believe that the Ark has been protected for 3,000 years, the priest says. I believe that protection has come from somewhere. Whether it's God's direct intervention or the power of faith itself, the result is the same. Those who should not enter do not enter. He tells you about the current guardian, speaking carefully, as if even mentioning the man might put him at risk. The guardian was chosen in 1969, relatively recently in the long history of the tradition. He was young, perhaps too young, some thought, barely 30 years old when he entered the sanctuary. But the signs had been clear. The patriarch of the time had declared him suitable, and he had accepted the calling. Now, 5 years into his guardianship, he finds himself protecting the ark, not in times of peace and certainty, but in the midst of revolution and doubt. The food that's passed through to him is often scarce, as the Derg's agricultural policies have created shortages throughout Ethiopia. The priests who tend to his minimal needs are themselves under surveillance. Even the daily rituals might be interrupted if the government decides to act. Does he know what's happening outside, you ask? Does he know about the revolution, the danger? Some things must be told to him, the priest admits. He must know if there's a threat so he can prepare. Prepare how? The priest doesn't answer directly. There are traditions, he says carefully, about what a guardian must do if the ark is truly in danger of being taken. Old traditions, desperate traditions, ones we hope will never need to be invoked. You press him, but he won't elaborate. Instead, he tells you about the broader crisis facing the Ethiopian Church. Hundreds of churches have been closed. Priests have been forced to renounce their vows. Ancient manuscripts have been burned as relics of a feudal past. The Derg is attempting to create a new Ethiopia, one that looks to Moscow rather than Jerusalem, that finds its meaning in collectivization rather than communion. But they can't erase 3,000 years, the priest says with quiet intensity. They can close our churches, arrest our clergy, mock our traditions. But the faith is older than any government. It will survive this, as it has survived everything else. You want to share his confidence, but you've seen what totalitarian governments can do to religions that refuse to submit. The Soviet Union has reduced the Orthodox Church there to a shadow of itself. China is in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, actively destroying every trace of religious life. Why should Ethiopia be different? Over the following weeks, you speak with others, historians, anthropologists, even some of the young revolutionaries who staff the Derg's propaganda offices. The revolutionaries speak earnestly about liberating the people from superstition, about using Ethiopia's resources for the benefit of all rather than for the glorification of an imaginary deity. When you mention the Ark, they roll their eyes. It's a fairy tale, one young officer tells you, a story to keep the peasants obedient. There's nothing in that chapel except an old man and whatever lies. The priests have told him to maintain the deception. Then why not prove it, you challenge? If it's just a story, open the sanctuary and show everyone there's nothing there. He becomes uncomfortable. There are political considerations. The patriarch has threatened mass unrest if the sanctuary is violated. We're still consolidating power. The timing isn't right. But you sense there's more to it than political calculation. Even these committed materialists, these scientific socialists, seem unwilling to actually test whether the stories about the Ark's power are true. It's easier to dismiss it as superstition than to confront it directly. You try carefully to get closer to the chapel itself, but the security is tighter than before. The boundary you once could approach is now patrolled by soldiers with explicit orders to turn everyone away. Even priests must request permission to enter the outer compound, and permission is often denied without explanation. One night, lying awake in your lodgings, you hear chanting. It's faint, distant, but unmistakable. The ancient liturgies of the Ethiopian Church being sung in Ge'ez. You follow the sound and find yourself among a group of perhaps 20 people, mostly elderly, gathered in someone's home. They're conducting a prayer service, quietly but defiantly, maintaining their worship despite the government's restrictions. They welcome you, this foreign visitor, with a generosity that seems almost reckless given the circumstances. An old woman, her face like weathered bronze, speaks to you through a translator. They can take our churches, she says. They can take our priests, but they cannot take the ark from the guardian. and they cannot take the guardian from the ark. This is our promise from God. This is our certainty. How can you be certain, you ask, falling back into your old habits of questioning? She smiles, revealing few teeth. I have lived 80 years. I have seen war, famine, occupation, revolution. I have seen everything change. But every morning of my life, I have known that in Axum a guardian rises to tend the ark. This has not changed. This will not change. This is more certain than the government, more certain than the emperor who is gone, more certain than the revolutionaries who will also be gone someday. Her certainty, rooted not in evidence but in a lifetime of unwavering faith, makes you understand something you'd missed in your earlier visit. The ark's power doesn't depend on its physical existence. Its power comes from the fact that generation after generation has organized their lives around it, has sacrificed for it, has derived meaning and purpose from serving it. Even if the ark were somehow proven to be absent from the sanctuary, a possibility you don't voice in this room, the faith it has generated would remain real, would continue to shape lives and communities. But that raises another question. If faith is what matters, why maintain the secrecy at all? Why not admit that the physical ark might be lost to history while celebrating the tradition it inspired? You pose this question to an Ethiopian scholar you meet at a cafe in Addis Ababa, where the surveillance is slightly less intense than in Aksum. He's a professor of history, educated at Oxford, straddling the line between academic skepticism and traditional faith. You're thinking like a Westerner, he says, not unkindly. You separate the symbol from the reality, the tradition from the truth. But for us, they are inseparable. The guardian guards the ark. This statement is true on multiple levels simultaneously. He guards the physical object, if it exists. He guards the tradition, which certainly exists. He guards the faith of millions, which is perhaps the most real thing of all. But the Derg could end all of that, you point out. They could storm the sanctuary tomorrow, reveal whatever is or isn't there, and destroy the mystery completely. The professor considers this. Could they, he asks, let's imagine they do exactly what you describe. They send soldiers into the sanctuary. They remove the guardian, perhaps kill him. They search the inner chamber. What do they find? Let's say they find nothing, just an empty room or perhaps some ordinary religious furnishings. What then? The church would be discredited, you suggest. The tradition would be revealed as a fraud. Would it? Or would the faithful say that the ark was moved, protected by God from profane hands? Or that it became invisible to the eyes of unbelievers? Or that its essence cannot be photographed or proved by material means? Faith that has lasted 3,000 years doesn't evaporate because a soldier with a rifle opens a door. And if they find something, you ask, if there actually is an artifact in there, then they face a different problem. How do they prove it's the actual ark? Any wooden or golden object they find could be a replica, a later creation, a symbolic representation. Without documentation from the time of Solomon, which doesn't exist, there's no way to authenticate it, so even finding something wouldn't settle the question. It would just create new debates, new uncertainties. You begin to see the genius of the Ethiopian Church's position. By maintaining absolute secrecy, they've made their claim unfalsifiable in a way that actually strengthens rather than weakens it. Any attempt to disprove the ark's presence can be interpreted as confirming it. Any failure to find it becomes evidence of divine protection. Any artifact discovered becomes subject to endless debate about authenticity. But this doesn't help the guardian who sits in his sanctuary while soldiers patrol outside and the revolution churns around him. You think about what his days must be like in 1974, the isolation that was always part of his calling, now compounded by the knowledge that his entire tradition is under existential threat. Does he pray more fervently? Does he wonder if he will be the last guardian, the one who sees 3 millennia of continuity come to an end? Your time in Ethiopia is running out. The Derg is becoming less tolerant of foreign observers, especially those asking questions about religious matters. Before you leave, you make one more attempt to get close to the chapel in Aksum. This time, you're stopped well before the old boundary line. A soldier, young enough to be your son, blocks your path with his rifle. "No foreigners," he says in halting English. Revolutionary directive. You try to explain that you're a scholar, a historian, that you've been coming to Aksum for years. He's unmoved. Behind him you can see the chapel, the same modest structure you've studied so many times. Somewhere inside it, a man you've never met continues his watch, unaware that you're standing here, thinking about him, wondering about his fate. The soldier follows your gaze. For a moment, something crosses his face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a flicker of the old. Faith not entirely suppressed by revolutionary education. They say there's something in there, he says quietly, almost to himself, something very old, very powerful. They say men die if they enter without permission. Do you believe that? You ask. He straightens, remembering his role. I believe in the revolution, he says firmly. I believe in science and progress. But not enough to try the door? You press gently. He doesn't answer, and in that silence you hear volumes. Even here, even now, the Ark's power persists, not as a weapon or a treasure, but as a boundary that even those who deny its existence are reluctant to cross. As you leave Aksum for what you suspect might be the last time for many years, you carry with you a deepened appreciation for what the Guardian represents. He's not just guarding an object, real or symbolic. He's guarding a space where the material and the spiritual intersect, where history and faith blur together, where the question of what's true becomes less important than the question of what has meaning. The revolution will continue. The Derg will rule for years, brutally in some cases, incompetently in others. Churches will close and reopen. Priests will be imprisoned and released. Ethiopia will suffer famine for war and chaos. But through it all, if the whispers you hear are true, the Guardian will maintain his watch, the daily rituals will continue, and the secret will be kept. You wonder if anyone outside of Ethiopia understands what an achievement this represents. In an age of satellites and mass media, in a time when privacy is dying and transparency is considered the highest virtue, here is a secret that has been kept for 3,000 years and shows no sign of being revealed. Here is a mystery that survives not because of sophisticated security, but because of simple, absolute faith, faith on the part of the Guardians, and faith on the part of a people who have decided that some things are too sacred to be shared, too holy to be proved, too important to be subjected to the corrosive light of empirical verification. From your airplane window, as Ethiopia falls away below you, you look north toward where Axum must lie, invisible in the distance. Somewhere in that ancient town, in a modest chapel, in an inner sanctuary no photographs have captured, a man kneels before something he believes with absolute certainty is the Ark of the Covenant. He will kneel there tomorrow and the day after, and every day until his death. And when he dies, another will take his place, continuing a chain of guardianship that stretches back beyond memory, beyond documentation, beyond proof. The plane climbs higher and Ethiopia vanishes beneath clouds, but the questions remain, suspended in the thin air, as mysterious and unyielding as they were when you first heard about the Guardian and his impossible charge all those years ago. What is he guarding? Why does it matter? And what kind of faith does it take to dedicate your entire existence to protecting something that the world will never see, can never verify, might not even believe exists? These questions have no answers that would satisfy a skeptic. But perhaps that's exactly the point. Perhaps the Ark's greatest power is not in what it is, but in what it makes people willing to become, guardians of mystery, keepers of faith, witnesses to something beyond the reach of evidence or reason or the demands of a world that wants everything explained, categorized, and made available for public consumption. The Guardian keeps his watch. The Ark remains hidden. And humanity, for all its satellites and technologies and revolutionary ideologies, has yet to breach that final sanctuary, that last preserve of absolute secrecy, in an age that has forgotten how to keep a secret at all. You're sitting in a small restaurant in Jerusalem in 1988, across from a man who won't meet your eyes. He's Ethiopian, perhaps in his late 50s, with the bearing of someone who was once accustomed to authority but has somehow lost his place in the world. His hand shakes slightly as he lifts his coffee cup, It takes him 3 tries to begin speaking. "I was a priest in Aksum," he says finally. "For 27 years. I served at the church compound. I was there when they chose the guardian in 1969. I was one of those who passed food to him every day for 15 years. I knew him before he entered the sanctuary. We studied together as young men. And then I watched him disappear into that room, and I never saw his face again." You've been tracking down stories like this for years now. Stories from people who were close to the Ark tradition, but who for various reasons have left Ethiopia and are willing to speak more freely than they could at home. This man contacted you through a mutual acquaintance saying he had something important to share. Now, sitting across from him, you sense both his need to talk and his deep reluctance, as if speaking these truths aloud might somehow compound a betrayal he's already committed. "What was his name?" you ask. "The guardian you knew?" The man shakes his head. "I cannot say it. Even now, even here, thousands of miles from Axum, I cannot speak his name. It's not permitted." Once a man becomes the guardian, his name becomes sacred, hidden. To speak it would be to violate everything I still hold dear. Despite. He trails off, and you wait. The restaurant around you continues its lunchtime bustle. Tourists planning their afternoon visits to holy sites, Israeli businessmen conducting loud negotiations, a family arguing good-naturedly about where to go next. None of them have any idea that the quiet Ethiopian man in the corner is about to reveal details about one of the world's greatest religious mysteries. "Despite leaving?" you finally prompt. "Despite running away," he corrects himself bitterly. "That's what I did. In 1984, during the worst of the famine, when Ethiopia was dying and the Derg was using food, as a weapon, I walked away from my vows. I told myself I was going to seek help for my people, to tell the world what was happening. But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I was afraid. Afraid of starving. Afraid of the soldiers. Afraid of being arrested for my faith. So I ran." He pauses, and you can see tears forming in his eyes. "I left the guardian there. I left him in that sanctuary with the ark, while the world fell apart around him. And I have never forgiven myself." This is what you've been searching for. A first-hand account from someone who was actually involved in the ark's protection, who can speak about the daily realities behind the legend. But you recognize that you're also witnessing a man's confession, and you try to tread carefully. "Tell me about him," you say. "Tell me what it was like to serve beside someone who had accepted that calling." The former priest closes his eyes, remembering. "He was the brightest of us," he begins, "not the most pious. There were others who prayed longer, fasted more severely, but he had a clarity about him, a sense of purpose. When we were students together, we would debate theology for hours. He could hold 6 different interpretations of a scripture in his mind simultaneously, see the truth in each one without being confused by the contradictions. What made them choose him? I don't know if I can explain it in a way you'll understand. The choosing of a guardian is not a rational process. The patriarch prays, consults with the senior clergy, studies signs and omens. Sometimes the choice seems obvious. A particular priest will have distinguished himself through years of exemplary service. Other times the choice surprises everyone. This was one of those surprising times. The former priest leans forward, his voice dropping even though no one around them understands Amharic. He was young, unmarried. All guardians must be unmarried, free of earthly attachments. But more than that, he had a quality that's hard to name. When you spoke with him, you felt that he was listening not just to your words, but to something deeper, something you hadn't even articulated. It was as if he could hear the questions behind your questions. Did he want to be chosen? The man considers this. Want is the wrong word. He accepted the possibility of being chosen the way you might accept the possibility of death, knowing it will come, preparing yourself spiritually, but not actively seeking it. When the patriarch called him forward and told him that he had been selected, I was standing nearby. I watched his face. There was no surprise there, no shock, just a kind of settling, as if something he'd always known would happen was finally occurring. What happened next? The preparation period lasted 3 months. During that time, the previous guardian was still alive, still serving, though we knew he was failing. The one who would replace him spent those months in intensive study, learning the rituals, the prayers, the secret knowledge that only guardians may possess. He fasted severely. He spoke little. He was separating himself from the world even before he entered the sanctuary. The former priest's hands have stopped shaking now. Lost in memory, he seems more at peace, as if the act of telling this story is itself a kind of absolution. On the day he was to enter, the entire church compound gathered. It was just before dawn. The patriarch blessed him, anointed him with oil. Other priests sang the ancient hymns. And then very simply, very quietly, the door to the inner sanctuary opened. The old guardian had died during the night. This was known only to a few of us, but it was the signal that the transition must occur immediately. Did you see inside, when the door opened? The former priest shakes his head. The angle was wrong. Only those who were directly in front of the door could see anything, and they never spoke of what they saw. But I watched him walk toward that door. I watched him pause on the threshold just for a heartbeat, and then he stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. And that was the end of the life he had known. You try to imagine it, being 30 years old and choosing to never again walk freely in the world, never to see a sunset or feel rain, never to share a meal with friends or attend a wedding or comfort a sick relative. All the small pleasures and sorrows of human existence voluntarily abandoned for a calling that demanded everything and offered nothing that the world would recognize as reward. What was the daily routine, you ask? How did you serve him? Very little contact was permitted. 3 times a day, food was passed through a small opening in the wall. The opening was barely large enough for a plate and cup. We never saw him through it. He would take the food only after we had stepped back and indicated that we had left. His waste was removed through a different opening using a system of baskets that ensured no direct contact. He never spoke to you? Not with words. But sometimes, when I placed the food in the opening, I would hear him praying, his voice, but changed, deepened by solitude perhaps, or by whatever he experienced in that sanctuary. It reminded me of the voice he had as a young man, but also not. It was as if the person he had been was still there, but was being slowly transformed into something else. The former priest signals the waiter for more coffee. The mundane gesture contrasts sharply with the story he's telling, and you realize this is intentional. He's grounding himself, reminding himself that he's in the ordinary world now, not in the sacred space he abandoned. What about illness, you ask? What happened if the guardian became sick? There were provisions for this. Certain medicines could be passed through with the food. If the guardian indicated through a system of signs that he needed medical attention, a physician who had been specially prepared could enter an outer chamber, not the inner sanctuary itself, but a space between the outer wall and the inner. The guardian would come to the barrier between this chamber and the sanctuary, and the physician could examine him and offer treatment through a screen. But this happened rarely. Guardians seemed to enjoy extraordinary health, living far longer than the average Ethiopian man of their time. That seems unlikely, you say. Surely the isolation, the lack of sunlight, the restricted movement would take a toll. You would think so, Sister, the former priest agrees. And yet, time after time, guardians lived into their 70s or 80s, some even longer. The one who served before my friend lasted 43 years. When he finally died, he was 91 years old. This in a country where most men were considered old at 60. How do you explain it? He spreads his hands. How do you explain faith? How do you explain the power of absolute purpose? These men were not just surviving in isolation. They were living out their deepest calling. Perhaps that made all the difference. Or perhaps, he hesitates, perhaps being in the presence of the ark itself conveyed some kind of protection, some blessing we don't understand. You believe the ark is really there? For the first time since your conversation began, the former priest looks directly at you. His eyes are clear, unwavering. I passed food through that opening for 15 years, he says. 15 years of daily routine, of small rituals, of maintaining the connection between the guardian and the world outside. And in all that time, I never doubted that he was in there with something real, something that demanded his total service. You can feel it, even from outside the sanctuary, a weight in the air, a sense of presence that has nothing to do with architecture or tradition. It's there. I know it's there. But you never saw it. No, and I never wanted to. Some things are too holy to look upon. The guardian sees it because that is his role, his burden, his privilege. The rest of us serve by not seeing, by maintaining the boundaries that keep the sacred sacred. The conversation shifts to the political situation in the 1980s. The former priest describes how the Derg's rule had become increasingly paranoid and oppressive. The famine that eventually killed nearly 1 million Ethiopians was made worse by government policies that forced farmers into collective agriculture and used food distribution as a tool of political control. In Aksum, as everywhere in Ethiopia, people were dying. We were starving, he says simply. The priests, the monks, the lay people who depended on the church, we had nothing. The Derg had closed most of our churches, confiscated what little we had, and still we had to feed the guardian. Still, we had to maintain the rituals. How did you manage? We lied, we stole. We begged from aid workers who came to distribute food. We took from our own mouths so that we could pass something, anything, through that opening 3 times a day. Because if the guardian went hungry, if he weakened, if he died without a successor being prepared, the entire tradition would be broken. 3,000 years would end because we couldn't keep one man fed. The anguish in his voice is raw. You begin to understand the weight he's been carrying all these years. There were nights, he continues, when I lay awake wondering if we were insane, wondering if it wouldn't be better to open that door, bring the guardian out, feed him properly, let him die as a normal man, rather than slowly starve in isolation. Or to finally reveal whatever is in there, whether it's the ark or not, and let the government take it if they wanted it so badly. At least then the pressure would be off. At least then we could focus on survival. But you didn't. No, we kept faith. Every day, 3 times a day, we brought what little food we had, and every day the guardian took it. And somehow, impossibly, he survived. We were dying in the streets, in our cells, in our homes, but the guardian lived. The former priest's voice breaks, and I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't watch my people suffer while we poured our last resources into maintaining a tradition that the world had forgotten and didn't care about. So I left. I told myself I was going to seek help, to tell the international community about the suffering, but really I was just running away from my failure to reconcile my faith with the reality of people dying around me. You sit with this for a moment, feeling the weight of his confession. Then you ask the question you've been building toward. What do you think would have happened if you had opened the sanctuary? If you had brought the guardian out? The former priest doesn't hesitate. It would have been the end, he says, not just of the tradition, but of something essential to Ethiopian identity. We have lost so much over the centuries, territory, power, the respect of the world. But we have always had this, the knowledge that we guard the ark, that we maintain an unbroken connection to the time of Solomon, that we are the chosen guardians of God's presence on earth. Take that away. And what are we? Just another poor African country with a history of famine and war. But that's exactly what you are, you point out gently. The ark doesn't change your economic situation. It doesn't feed the hungry or cure the sick. Doesn't it? He challenges. Faith feeds people, even when their stomachs are empty. Purpose sustains communities, even when their material conditions are desperate. The guardian in his sanctuary, maintaining his watch through famine and revolution and hardship, tells every Ethiopian that perseverance is possible, that there are things worth protecting even at the cost of everything else. That's not nothing. That's maybe the only thing that matters. He pauses, then adds quietly, which is why my leaving was such a betrayal. Abandon not just my post, but the idea that some duties transcend circumstances. I proved myself weaker than the guardian, who stayed, who always stays. You're beginning to see the layers of this story, how the Ark and its guardian function not just as religious symbols, but as embodiments of a kind of absolute commitment that most people, most societies, have lost or never had. In a world of compromise and pragmatism, here is something uncompromising. In an age of transparency and access, here is something utterly hidden. In a time of individual choice and self-actualization, here is a role that demands the complete abnegation of individual will. Do you know what happened to him, you ask? The guardian you knew? The former priest nods slowly. I have heard rumors through the network of exiled Ethiopians. They say he is still serving, still maintaining his watch. That would make it 19 years now since he entered. He would be 49 years old, though I imagine the isolation has aged him beyond his years. Have you thought about going back? Every day, but I cannot. I broke my vows. I abandoned my post. There is no returning from that, no way to undo what I did. I live here in Jerusalem as close as I can get to the holy places without actually being able to serve them, and I pray for forgiveness I don't deserve. He finishes his coffee and prepares to leave, but before he does, he reaches into his jacket and pulls out a small, worn photograph. He slides it across the table to you. This was taken the week before he entered the sanctuary, he says. It's the only picture I kept when I fled. I'm not sure why I'm showing you this. Maybe because I need someone else to know what he looked like, to remember that he was a real person with a real face before he disappeared into that room forever. You look at the photograph. It shows a young man in priestly robes standing in what appears to be the church compound at Aksum. He's thin, as most Ethiopians were even in good times, with a narrow face and intelligent eyes. He's not smiling, but there's a quality to his expression that the former priest described, a kind of listening stillness, as if he's attending to something beyond the camera's frame. May I keep this? You ask. The former priest hesitates, then nods. Perhaps it's better if someone who can still speak about these things has it. I've kept it hidden too long. He rises to leave, then pauses. One more thing. When I left Axum, when I was making my way toward the Sudan border with other refugees, we stopped at a small village for the night. There was an old woman there. She must have been 90 or more. When she learned I was a priest from Axum, she grabbed my hand and wouldn't let go. She said, "Is he still there? Is the guardian still watching over the ark?" I told her yes, he was still there. And she smiled and released my hand and said, "Then there is hope. As long as someone keeps watch, there is always hope." The former priest's eyes are wet now. I think about that old woman often. She was dying. You could see it in her face, the way famine and hardship had hollowed her out. She had nothing, no reason to hope for anything in this world. But knowing that somewhere in Axum a man was still keeping his vigil, still maintaining the ancient watch, that was enough for her. That gave her something to hold on to. He leaves then, disappearing into the Jerusalem crowds, one more exile carrying the weight of choices made in impossible circumstances. You sit alone with the photograph of a young man who chose to give up his face, his name, his life in the world, to become a guardian of something that might not even exist in the way his tradition claims. But watching people stream past the restaurant window, pilgrims and tourists and locals, all of them moving freely through the city, making choices about where to go and what to see, you think about that old woman in the village, about how, for her and for millions like her, the guardian's invisible vigil mattered more than any material help, any political change, any rational argument about the ark's authenticity. The guardian keeps watch. This simple fact, this stubborn persistence of an ancient tradition in the face of every modern pressure to abandon it, tells a story about what humans need beyond food and shelter and security. It tells a story about how meaning is created and sustained, about how communities preserve their identity across millennia, about how faith works when it's stripped of everything except the bare act of faithful service. You look again at the photograph, trying to imagine what that young man must have been thinking as it was taken, knowing his days in the visible world were numbered. Did he feel fear, regret? Or had he already begun the process of detachment that would allow him to enter that sanctuary and never look back? The photograph doesn't answer, like the Ark itself, like the whole magnificent mystery of Axum and its guardian tradition. It simply exists, silent and enigmatic, asking questions that have no easy answers, and perhaps no answers at all. The conversation with the former priest haunts you for months afterward. You find yourself researching the Ethiopian diaspora, tracking down others who left during the famines and wars of the 1980s. Most are reluctant to speak about religious matters. Their exile has been traumatic enough without reopening wounds about faith and duty and choices made under duress. But gradually you piece together a fuller picture of what it meant to maintain the Ark tradition during Ethiopia's darkest modern period. You learn about priests who died of starvation rather than abandon their posts, about monastery communities that were bombed by the Derg for refusing to close, about sacred texts hidden in caves and buried in gardens, waiting for a time when they could be safely retrieved. And through it all, according to every source you find, the guardian remained in his sanctuary. Food reached him somehow, even when there was no food. The rituals continued, even when churches elsewhere were being demolished. The watch was kept, even when keeping it seemed to serve no practical purpose whatsoever. You begin to understand that this isn't irrational. It's a different kind of rationality, one that operates on a time scale that makes individual lives and even generations seem like brief moments. The Ethiopian Church has been playing a very long game, one that began 3,000 years ago and has no defined endpoint. From that perspective, a few decades of hardship under the Derg are merely one more challenge in a long series of challenges that have all been overcome by the simple act of persistence. The guardian embodies this persistence in its purest form. He can't compromise, can't adapt, can't find creative solutions to new problems. He can only do what every guardian before him has done: maintain the rituals, protect what's in his care, and trust that the tradition itself will somehow survive whatever immediate crisis threatens it. It's profoundly conservative in a way that modern sensibilities struggle with, but it's also profoundly radical, a complete rejection of the idea that adaptation and flexibility are always virtues, that change is always necessary, that nothing is worth total sacrifice. You travel to other countries with Ethiopian diaspora communities, Sudan, Israel, the United States. Everywhere you find the same pattern. Ethiopians who have left their homeland clinging to their religious identity with an intensity that goes beyond normal religious observance. They build churches that replicate Aksumite architecture. They conduct services in Ge'ez, though many no longer understand the language. They tell their children about the Ark, about the Guardian, about the unbroken tradition that connects them to Solomon and Sheba and the very dawn of their civilization. In Washington, D.C., you meet a woman in her 70s who left Ethiopia in 1985. She runs a small Ethiopian restaurant, and above the cash register hangs a painting of the church compound at Aksum. When you ask about it, her face lights up. "I have never seen the Ark," she tells you. "I have never even been close to the inner sanctuary, but I know it is there. I know the guardian watches over it. This knowledge has sustained me through 40 years of exile, through poverty, through the death of my husband, through everything. Because if the guardian can keep his faith in that tiny room year after year, then I can keep my faith in this tiny restaurant day after day." The comparison might seem absurd, equating running a restaurant with guarding the Ark of the Covenant. But you're starting to see that this is exactly the point. The guardian's extreme devotion authorizes and validates all the smaller devotions, all the ordinary acts of faithfulness that people perform in their daily lives. His absolute commitment makes their relative commitments meaningful. In Los Angeles, you speak with a young Ethiopian American, third generation, who has never been to Ethiopia but who speaks passionately about the Ark and its importance to his identity. "My grandfather used to tell me," he says, "that as long as the guardian keeps watch, we are still a people. We're not just scattered refugees or immigrants or minorities in other people's countries. We're the guardians of something eternal, something that was important before America existed and will be important long after it's gone." "But you've never seen this thing you're guarding," you point out. "You don't even know for certain that it exists." He shrugs. I've never seen God either. That doesn't make God less real to me. The ark is like that. It exists in the realm of faith, of tradition, of identity. Whether it's a physical object in a room in Axum or something more symbolic, it serves the same function. It anchors us. You recognize the theological sophistication in his answer. He's not claiming simplistic material existence for the ark. He's describing a more complex reality where physical and spiritual existence blur together, where the question, does it exist, becomes less important than the question, what does it mean? But there are others you discover who aren't satisfied with such ambiguity. In London, you meet a historian of Ethiopian origin who has spent years researching the ark tradition and has come to controversial conclusions. It's a useful fiction, he tells you bluntly over dinner in Bloomsbury, a story that the Church has maintained for political and social reasons, but one that has no basis in historical fact. The ark, if it ever existed in the form described in the Bible, was almost certainly destroyed when Babylon sacked Jerusalem. Every scholarly treatment of the subject confirms this. The Ethiopian tradition is exactly what it appears to be. A later accretion, a legend that served the interests of rulers who wanted to claim connection to the biblical narrative. Then why has it persisted, you ask? Why have intelligent people, educated people, dedicated their lives to guarding something that doesn't exist? The historian sighs. Because sometimes the story is more important than the truth. The story of the guardian, the tradition of absolute dedication, the claim to possess something unique and holy. These give Ethiopia a place in world history, a significance beyond its material circumstances. Take the story away, and what does Ethiopia have? Poverty, political instability, a history of being colonized and exploited. Keep the story, and Ethiopia has a sacred mission, a divine mandate, a reason to be proud despite everything. His argument is compelling, but it troubles you. It reduces the guardian to a pawn in a political game, strips his sacrifice of meaning, makes the whole tradition into a kind of elaborate deception, even if it's a well-intentioned one. What about the men who serve as guardians, you challenge? Are they deceived? Are they knowingly participating in a fraud? The historian considers this carefully. I think they believe, he admits. I think the faith is genuine, even if the object of faith is not what they think it is. They enter that sanctuary believing they will encounter the Ark of the Covenant, and what they experience there, the isolation, the prayer, the weight of tradition, convinces them that they have. The human mind is extraordinarily good at creating the experiences it expects to have. But that doesn't explain the persistence, you argue. If it were just a matter of individual belief, the tradition would have collapsed at some point. Someone would have broken, would have revealed the truth, would have admitted that there's nothing there, or that what's there isn't what everyone thinks it is. Would they, the historian asks, consider the cost of such a revelation? The guardian who admitted the ark wasn't real would destroy his own life's meaning, betray his people's faith, bring shame to his church and his nation. What person, having dedicated everything to a calling, having sacrificed everything, could bear to admit that the sacrifice was meaningless? It's psychologically impossible. So the tradition perpetuates itself through the very intensity of the commitment it demands. You think about the young man in the photograph, the one who entered the sanctuary in 1969 and has been there ever since, if the rumors are true. According to the historian's interpretation, that man has spent nearly 2 decades alone in a room, performing rituals before an empty space, or perhaps before some ordinary religious object that has been invested with meaning it doesn't inherently possess. The loneliness of that scenario is somehow worse than the traditional understanding. At least if the ark is real, his suffering has objective meaning. If it's not, if he's guarding a fiction, then his entire life has been wasted in service of a lie. But you're not sure the historian is right. Or rather, you're not sure that right and wrong are the relevant categories here. The ark tradition exists in a space that transcends simple truth or falsehood. It's a performance that has been going on so long with such commitment that it has generated its own reality. You think of all the people you've interviewed, the priests who maintained the rituals during famine, the diaspora communities who organize their identities around a tradition they'll never directly experience, the guardian himself who persists in isolation year after year. If the Ark is a fiction, it's one that has had more impact on the world than most facts. If it's a story, it's one that has shaped nations and sustained faith and given meaning to millions of lives across 3,000 years. What is that if not real?